Hi everybody. Today I'm going to read you a book called I've Seen the Promised Land, The Life of Dr. Martin Luther King. On Monday we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, and we don't come to school because it's a day that we celebrate his birthday because he was a very important man in our history. March of 1968. The country was in turmoil. There were protests against racial injustice. On college campuses, young men and women were opposing the long war in Vietnam. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. looked at the small mountain of mail on his secretary's desk. He knew there would be requests for him to speak at schools and churches from people who loved and respected him. There would also be ugly letters full of threats and hatred. Dr. King had been invited to Memphis, Tennessee, where sanitation workers were on strike. He was tired, but he felt he had to offer his support. Dr. King could not enjoy his own good fortune, even though he had worked hard for it, as long as there was poverty anywhere in the world. Poverty means when you're very poor, when you don't have a lot of money. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15, 1929. His father was one of the most respected ministers in Atlanta, but Atlanta was part of the segregated South. Segregated means that it was separate, and young Martin had to put up with the pain of being judged by the color of his skin. He worked hard in school, and he became a minister like his father. He was eager to spread the word of God's love for all people. Then on December 1st, 1955, an event occurred in Montgomery, Alabama that would make many demands on him, but also give him the opportunity to seek justice for all Americans. The laws in Montgomery said that whites would sit in the front of the buses and blacks would sit in the back of the buses. If all the front seats were taken, then any blacks who had seats would have to give them up. One evening, a woman named Rosa Parks, returning after a hard day's work, refused to give up her seat. She was arrested for breaking the law. In response to Mrs. Parks' arrest, the black people of Montgomery planned to boycott the city buses. They said that they would not pay money to ride buses if they had to give up their seats just because they were not white people. At that time, Dr. King was the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery. People were so impressed with the young minister that they asked him to lead the boycott. Dr. King knew that leading a boycott would be difficult and perhaps even dangerous, but he believed that individuals had the responsibility of making democracy work. There were groups that would do anything to stop black people from being treated as equals. Local police arrested Dr. King just to harass him, and a firebomb was thrown into the porch of his house. This evil act frightened the young minister, but he didn't back down. He believed so strongly in the cause of justice that he had to do what was right, even if his life was at risk. His wife, Coretta Scott King, had a small baby to care for, but she supported her husband's decision. There he is in jail. Montgomery laws are unconstitutional, the picture says. The boycott lasted over a year. Finally, in June of 1956, the District Court of the United States ruled that the laws separating whites and blacks on the Montgomery buses was unconstitutional, and that means that you cannot do it anymore in the United States because it's not allowed. This ruling was later affirmed by the Supreme Court. Finally, the buses in Montgomery were integrated, which meant blacks and white people could ride anywhere they wanted on the bus. They could take any seat they wanted. The Montgomery bus boycott was one of the most important events in the civil rights movement. It showed that people could make changes in a system that had lasted for decades if they had the right leadership. Martin Luther King Jr., recognized as that kind of a leader, was arrested again and again as he protested the laws and practices that hurt his people. The arrest did not stop his activity or his determination. Being in prison was hard, but it was a difficulty that Dr. King gladly accepted because he knew what he was doing was right. In 1959, Dr. King spent a month in India studying the techniques of nonviolent protest practiced by the great Indian leader Mohandas Gandhi. Dr. King had studied Gandhi's life and had taken his philosophy of nonviolence into his own heart. Many black people were disappointed with Dr. King's belief in nonviolence and love for all people. Some argued that blacks didn't need people to love, they just needed justice. In the South, black protests and attempts at integration were met with beatings and jailings. It was clear that those who opposed equal rights for blacks did not mind using violence. While Dr. King spoke throughout the United States of nonviolence, there were others with different ideas. One of them was a man known as Malcolm X. Whoever heard of a nonviolent revolution, Malcolm X asked, but Dr. King knew that people would come to understand and respect one another only through love, not force. The movement for justice, for bringing all people together, took many forms. In the South, Dr. King led nonviolent marches. He insisted that those who worked with him practice nonviolence, even though he acknowledged that it was not always an easy path to follow. Sometimes in northern cities, young people exploded with anger. Dr. King understood their impatience, but did not think that violence could ever turn back the winds of hatred. By 1963, the voices of those who were against nonviolence grew louder. President Kennedy seemed sympathetic to the black cause, but blacks across the country were becoming discouraged as the hostility against them increased. Night after night, news broadcasts carried stories of people being beaten, assaulted with fire hoses, and bitten by dogs as they stood up for equality. Dr. King refused to be drawn into the hatred that was directed against him. He insisted on loving his enemies and conducting the struggle of Black America on the high plane of dignity and discipline. In August 1963, a march on Washington was planned. Hundreds of thousands of people, black and white, from around the country and around the world gathered in the nation's capital to protest the wrongs in our society. It was here that Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He spoke of a dream in which the sons of slaves and the sons of slave owners could sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He spoke of the day when his 4 little children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. On that hot summer day, thousands of Americans expressed their heartfelt desire for fairness and justice. It was a glorious day for America. On September 15, 1963, less than a month after the March on Washington, a bomb blast shattered the early morning stillness in Birmingham, Alabama. When the smoke cleared, 4 black girls lay dead in the rubble of the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was the kind of brutality against which Dr. King had always spoken. The country mourned as Dr. King declared that the 4 girls had not died in vain. Tears were shed as he called them heroines in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. But for many of the forces of evil seemed to have the upper hand. Then in November 1963, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated, which means he was shot and killed. Violence seemed to rule the country. Dr. King maintained his course. He had been jailed, his life had been threatened, bombs had been thrown at his house, and still he carried on. People asked him how long he would carry on in the face of growing brutality. How long? How long? The question tormented Dr. King, but he had faith that hatred could not last forever. He still believed that justice would rise up from the ashes of despair and that those who held out for love would one day prevail. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his great work. Over the next few years, Dr. King watched in sorrow as anger roared through the streets of our nation's cities. In 1965, Malcolm X became another victim of violence, brutally murdered as he spoke to those he hoped to help. Dr. King understood that it sometimes seemed right to tear down a society that simply would not listen to the reason of justice, but he knew that one day justice would win out over evil. In the spring of 1968, Dr. King had been asked to support the striking sanitation workers in Memphis. Just days before his arrival, there were signs that the promised peaceful protest would be hard to control. Dr. King was discouraged, but he put aside his feelings, and he thought that if he put himself before the people, that they would remain calm. On March 28th, Dr. King led a march through downtown Memphis. The anger that the sanitation workers felt boiled over into the streets. The result was, for Dr. King, a disaster. One young man was killed and 50 others were injured. Dr. King wondered if his message had fallen on deaf ears. On April 3, 1968, at the Masonic Temple in Memphis, Dr. King spoke of his life. He said he'd been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land. He knew he might not reach that land with his people, but still he had held on to the faith that America would become the promised land of liberty and justice for all. The next evening, on April 4th, Dr. King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Dr. King fell backward. The man who preached nonviolence had been murdered. Dr. King knew that there would be a day when he would die, and he knew that he might die a violent death. Yet Dr. King's legacy lives with all of us. His example stands as a glowing light for us to follow, and it is to the mountaintop of idealism and the hope of justice that we look to find his image still. Dr. King wanted to be remembered simply as someone who had tried to do his best and to serve all people regardless of race. He wanted to be remembered as someone who believed in love, who believed in peace. He wanted to be remembered as someone who did not turn away from those who were hungry or those in prison. And so we remember him as a man, as a leader, and as a father. We look to him as a man who tried to keep our country on the righteous path to freedom and equality. The end. So he was a pretty amazing man that he was able to stay peaceful and try to encourage people to be peaceful and get along and put away their hatred. And it really did help the country a lot. And that's why we're where we are today. A big reason is because of his philosophy and the way he talked to people. He got a lot of people to realize that violence is not the answer. But as we've seen even this year, we still have a long way to go. And we're kind of like we were back in 1968. We've seen some of that over the summer. And it remains to be seen if, who will emerge as the leaders. And that hopefully America can move forward again towards equality and justice.